Hello and welcome to The Search. I'm Shahei Jurgen. We're continuing to discuss the middle section of 1 Corinthians chapters 8 through 10. Today we'll start by reading from 1 Corinthians 10 at verse 1. For I do not want you to be ignorant of the fact, brothers and sisters, that our ancestors were all under the cloud, and that they all passed through the sea. They were all baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. They all ate the same spiritual food and drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank from the spiritual rock that accompanied them, and that rock was Christ. Nevertheless, God was not pleased with most of them. Their bodies were scattered in the wilderness. Now these things occurred as examples to keep us from setting our hearts on evil things as they did. Do not be idolaters, as some of them were. As it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink, and got up to indulge in revelry. We should not commit sexual immorality, as some of them did, and in one day 23,000 of them died. We should not test Christ, as some of them did, and were killed by snakes. And do not grumble, as some of them did, and were killed by the destroying angel. These things happened to them as examples, and were written down as warnings for us, on whom the culmination of the ages has come. So, if you think you're standing firm, be careful that you don't fall. No temptation has overtaken you except what is common to mankind, and God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear. But when you are tempted, He will also provide a way out so that you can endure it. Now, this is lesson 14 in our series, the book of 1 Corinthians. We'll be considering chapter 10, verses 1 through 13, and the title of our lesson is Learning from History. As we have been discussing, the central theme or topic being considered by Paul in 1 Corinthians 8 through 10 revolves around idolatry, particularly whether or not Christians can attend festivals held in an idol temple. Now, Paul highlighted the Corinthian argument that since idols were nothing, idol feasts were no more than banquets that any Christian could attend. The immediate concern with this line of thinking back in chapter 8 was the fact that not all of the Corinthian Christians agreed with that view. Among the Corinthians, there were some who opposed any association with idolatry, but they were too weak to stand up for their convictions, and they were being influenced to do something they knew was wrong. Paul concluded in 1 Corinthians 8 that even if going to idol feasts was generally acceptable, which it wasn't, it still would have been wrong for the Corinthians to do it because it was negatively impacting the conscience of their weak brethren. When love guides the actions of Christians, believers will always consider the scruples of others. In chapter 9, Paul continued this discussion by offering himself as an example. He definitively proved that preachers have the right to be financially supported for their ministry, but followed such proof with this statement, "But I have not used any of these rights." Chapter 9, verse 15. He had decided to waive his God-given right for financial support because he was concerned with how it would affect his work among the Corinthians. In fact, Paul was willing to adjust all kinds of behaviors so that his preaching might be more effective among a wide range of people. Paul concluded chapter 9 with a note about the importance of self-control. The apostle would not allow his body to dictate his decisions. And remember, the issue at hand here is eating at idol feast. So it doesn't matter how succulent the meal might be or how important it is to make business contacts with members of the Corinthian community. This was a matter of self-control. And in the first part of chapter 10, Paul reminded the Corinthians what a lack of self-control and flirtation with idolatry can do to a group of God's people. So let's read again 1 Corinthians 10, verses 1 through 4. For I do not want you to be ignorant of the fact, brothers and sisters, that our ancestors were all under the cloud, and that they all passed through the sea. They all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. They all ate the same spiritual food and drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank from the spiritual rock that accompanied them, and that rock was Christ. The apostle used the word all 5 times here when describing the ancient Israelites. All our ancestors, all passed through the sea, all were baptized, all ate the same spiritual food, all drank the same spiritual drink. All these children of God enjoyed the same blessings and benefits. However, as Paul will discuss in the next paragraph, being recipients of God's mercy and kindness did not make all the people of Israel immune from the dangers of idolatry. Paul called to mind several incidents surrounding the exodus from Egypt and Israel's journey into the wilderness. We remember that God wrought 10 devastating plagues upon Egypt, and that this launched a multi-phase process that brought his people into a covenant relationship with him and eventually would bring them to the promised land. So the apostle is paralleling here the downfall of Israel with the temptations facing the Corinthian Christians. The children of Israel were God's chosen people, but they often struggled with the allure of idolatry. Therefore, the Corinthians needed to learn from Israel's history in order to overcome their own struggles with fleeing from idolatry. As Morris writes, Paul has argued that the strong should have concern for the weak and has emphasized his own example. That's chapters 8 and 9. Now he shows from the history of the people of God that the enjoyment of high privilege does not guarantee final blessing. The Israelites of old experienced redemption, baptism, and God's continuing help, but they flirted with idolatry, and nearly all of them perished in the wilderness. It may be that some of the Corinthians felt that their baptism and their use of Holy Communion guaranteed their final salvation, no matter what they did. Paul warns them that this is not so. Idolatry brings ruin. The historical events outlined here in chapter 10 are documented in Exodus chapters 12 through 17. They mostly occurred during Israel's brief wilderness journey between Egypt and Sinai, although some of the events that Paul will discuss later also occur later. So let's examine these statements that Paul makes about Israel's situation. First, he says Israel was under the cloud. Now, the cloud was that supernatural manifestation of God's glory and presence. It first appeared as the people made their way to the sea in Exodus 13, verse 21. The cloud represented God's direction, his leading, his presence. By following the cloud, Israel was submitting to the will of God. Next, Paul says that Israel passed through the sea. Moses, of course, marched Israel to the sea with the Egyptian army in pursuit. The writer of Hebrews described this incredible scene by saying, "By faith, the people passed through the Red Sea as on dry land, but when the Egyptians tried to do so, they were drowned." Hebrews 11:29. So we could say that if being under the cloud, as Paul describes it, represents Israel's submission to the will of God, stepping out onto the seabed here was an act of faith. They trusted that God would safely see them to the other side. Next, Paul says that Israel was baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. Now, Paul describes here this water crossing as a kind of baptism. The waters were pulled apart and became walls on both sides. The cloud was above their heads as they passed through the sea. And in this event, Israel left the bondage of Egypt. Paul talks about Christians who leave the bondage of sin at their own baptism in Romans 6, verses 3 through 7. And so as the Israelites followed the direction of the Lord, they were professing their faith in God, and ultimately they were baptized. Paul is showing here with all of these parallels that the Israelites followed a plan of redemption. They were redeemed by the hand of God in faith and baptism, just as the Corinthians were. When they learned the gospel of Christ, they put their faith in King Jesus, the Messiah, and they were baptized into Christ. So after all of that, after they put their faith in God and the Israelites were baptized through the sea crossing, Paul says next, they ate the same spiritual food. So we have the realities of desert wandering, which quickly set in for Israel after the waterway crossing, and it caused the people to cry out to God for sustenance. In response, God told Moses, I'm going to rain bread from heaven, Exodus 16 and verse 4. And Paul calls the manna there spiritual food because it came to Israel supernaturally. Jesus also made a connection between himself and the manna from above. He famously said, I am the bread of life. Your ancestors ate the manna in the wilderness, yet they died. But here is the bread that comes down from heaven, which anyone may eat and not die. I'm the living bread that came down from heaven. Whoever eats this bread will live forever. This bread is my flesh, which I will give for the life of the world. John 6, verses 48 through 51. Now, this is remarkable. After their baptism, Israel was, in a sense, communing with Christ when they ate the manna. The Lord was their provision, and now he says he's the life-giving provision for the whole world. And then lastly, Israel drank the same spiritual drink. Again, the harshness of the desert made it difficult to find food, but especially water. So God the provider once again came to the aid of his people. We read in Exodus 17, verses 5 and 6, that Yahweh answered Moses, go out in front of the people. Take with you some of the elders of Israel, and take in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile, and go. I will stand there before you by the rock at Horeb. Strike the rock, and water will come out of it for the people to drink. So Moses did this in the sight of the elders of Israel. Now, Jesus was the first one to make the connection between himself and manna in John 6, but Paul adds something further than that. He identifies the water-producing rock as Christ. He says that the Israelites drank the same spiritual rock that accompanied them, and that rock was Christ. Chapter 10 and verse 4. Now, what is the point of all of these parallels, of Paul paralleling the Israelite experience of redemption and communion, baptism, with what the Corinthians were experiencing and with the challenges they were facing? Well, I think there are a couple, maybe three main points of commonality that Paul is really going to try to drive home. The first is his emphasis on the fact that God provides for his people. So for Israel, the cloud led them, the sea parted, Moses directed them, manna fed them, the rock quenched their thirst. God was providing for his people, the people he had redeemed, every step of the way. A second important connection point seems to be that God's provision is received through faithfulness. Israel followed the cloud, trusted in God at the sea crossing, yielded to Moses in baptism, and gathered manna for 6 days but rested on the Sabbath. Trust and loyalty to God were crucial for their success. But then finally, and maybe this is the most important point that Paul is going to draw out as he continues this discussion, and that is a reminder of something the Corinthians already knew. Eating and drinking is fellowship. Again, this concept is central to the discussion. Paul's already established this. Of course, this was something that everyone in the ancient world already knew, but he talked about this in terms of the issue with the sexually immoral brother mentioned in chapter 5, when he told those Christians, the Corinthian Christians rather, in chapter 5 and verse 11, now I'm writing to you that you must not associate with anyone who claims to be a brother or sister, but is sexually immoral or greedy, an idolater or slanderer, a drunkard or swindler. Do not even eat with such people. So there's this connection here between eating and drinking and fellowship. Don't eat and drink with the sexually immoral brother. You're to withdraw your fellowship from him. And Israel, by eating manna and drinking from that rock, they were in fellowship with Christ. Now, that's an amazing thing. They didn't realize that was true because they didn't know anything about Christ, yet they were still in fellowship with him as the one who was providing these blessings to them. So now, Paul takes those spiritual highlights that Israel enjoyed in response to their leading from God, their faith, their baptism, their communion. And he now is going to pivot to the other side of the coin, which is to see now how Israel went from great heights to destruction. We pick up reading in 1 Corinthians 10, verse 5. Nevertheless, God was not pleased with most of them. Their bodies were scattered in the wilderness. Now these things occurred as examples to keep us from setting our hearts on evil things as they did. Do not be idolaters, as some of them were. As it's written, the people sat down to eat and drink and got up to indulge in revelry. We should not commit sexual immorality, as some of them did, and in one day 23,000 of them died. We should not test Christ, as some of them did and were killed by snakes. And do not grumble, as some of them did and were killed by the destroying angel. God was not pleased with most of the people, despite the triumph of the Exodus and their deliverance from Egypt. Paul says this is evidenced by the fact that their corpses were left scattered in the desert. So just as the highlights were outlined in the previous paragraph, now we see the lowlights and the demonstration of why God was so displeased with them. The first thing Paul teaches us is that Israel was guilty of faithlessness. The primary reason most of that generation never saw the promised land was because of their lack of trust in God's ability to defeat the Canaanite giants and fortified cities. You can read about this in Numbers 14. They said they wish they just died in Egypt or even out in the wilderness. And the Israelites immediately sought to reject Moses and Aaron and to choose new leaders to take them back to Egypt. And in response to this, God said to Moses, "Not one of those who saw my glory and the signs I performed in Egypt and in the wilderness, but who disobeyed me and tested me 10 times, not one of them will ever see the land I promised on oath to their ancestors. Not one who has treated me with contempt will ever see it." Numbers 14, 22 and 23. The Exodus generation that had received all of these incredible blessings from God, they died in the wilderness, save except the faithful spies Joshua and Caleb. And this was a result of their lack of faith in God. In addition to their faithlessness, Israel, of course, was guilty of idolatry. Now, the specific act of idolatry that's mentioned by Paul refers to the construction and worship of the golden calf at Mount Sinai. You remember that Moses was atop the mountain with God, but down below, the people had convinced Aaron to build an idol. And Paul said about this, the people sat down to eat and drink and got up to indulge in revelry in 1 Corinthians 10, verse 7. But I want you to notice that Paul is only partially citing Exodus 32 and verse 6. Exodus says they rose up early the next day and offered burnt offerings and brought sacrifices of well-being. And the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to revel. So we might ask the question, why did Paul refrain from mentioning the burnt offerings and sacrifices? You know, I would reason in my own mind that offering sacrifices to the idol would be the worst offense, certainly worse than eating or drinking, maybe worse than rising up to revel, which is probably a reference to sexual immorality. But it seems that Paul was again emphasizing this same connection between feasting and fellowship. Offering sacrifices to idols was wrong, but everybody believed that, save the idolaters. All the Corinthian Christians believed that. Even those who said it was okay to go to the idol feast, they never would have thought, never would have dreamed that it was okay to go offer sacrifices to those idols. But Paul says it's not just sacrificing to the idol that Israel was guilty of. They were also guilty of feasting in the idol's presence. And obviously that is going to have direct application to what was happening in Corinth. Third, Paul says that Israel was guilty of sexual immorality. When Balaam failed to curse Israel, the women of Moab were dispatched to seduce the men. You can read about this in Numbers 25. Now, Paul previously noted that there is a connection, and was a connection in the ancient world, between fornication and idolatry. This was a topic discussed back in 1 Corinthians 6, verses 9 through 11. Prostitutes in the ancient world would solicit worshipers as they came to attend these festivals that were held at the idol temple. There would have been no way for believers to avoid the lewdness on display. And I think the message, again, as it was in 1 Corinthians 6, is that Christians need to stay as far away from the idol temple as possible so that they might avoid this kind of debauchery. Fourth, Paul says Israel was guilty of tempting Christ. And this means they put the Lord to the test. And the way they did this was by constantly questioning God's goodness and provoking his anger. Sometimes when I read from Exodus and Numbers, it just seems like they wanted to push God as far as they possibly could, as they thought they could. Of course, they never really get away with it. The Israelites would even bemoan, like in Numbers 11:5, "Oh, we remember the fish we used to eat in Egypt for nothing, the cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, and the garlic." And so maybe the Corinthians were doing what the Israelites had done. They were reminiscing about the delicacies served at the idol feast. "Oh, we remember how good the spread was last year. What could possibly be wrong with us going back to enjoy such a delicious meal?" And so Paul again draws another parallel between what the Corinthians were doing and what Israel had done and then were destroyed as a result. And finally, number 5, he says, Israel was guilty of complaining. Paul wrote, "Do not grumble, as some of them did and were killed by the destroying angel," chapter 10, verse 10. Now, this is probably a reference to the Levitical uprising that was led by Korah, which was coupled with a political rebellion led by Dathan and Abiram, who were a couple of Reubenites. But we might say, okay, well, what's the connection between that rebellion in Israel, among the Israelites, and the Corinthian idol feast? Well, remember that these festivals that were held in the city of Corinth were not just occasions for worship or for dining. They were massive community social events. So this was your opportunity to gain business contacts, to find investors for a new venture or customers for a new product. Idol festivals were occasions to increase one's standing in the community. And that's what Korah, Dathan, and Abiram wanted. They wanted an elevated position in the community. They objected to Moses and Aaron having an exclusive right of leadership or the exclusive right to the priesthood. They complained about all this, and they were destroyed. And the Corinthians may have been complaining too, complaining that their social status was going to suffer if they don't attend these festivals and eat at these feasts any longer. And so, Paul tells us that the Israelites of old had followed God. They'd put their trust in him. They were baptized in the sea, but not far into their walk with the Lord, apostasy ensued. They lost their faith in God. They lost their trust that he would give them the promised land. They feasted in the presence of idols. They committed sexual immorality. They provoked God's anger, and they complained and complained and complained. Idolatry and immorality brought Israel nothing but heartache, sorrow, and death. And Paul says Christians must learn from their example. And so we round out this section by reading verses 11 through 14. These things happened to them as examples, and were written down as warnings for us, on whom the culmination of the ages has come. So if you think that you're standing firm, be careful that you don't fall. No temptation has overtaken you except what is common to mankind, and God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear. But when you're tempted, he will also provide a way out so that you can endure it. Therefore, my dear friends, flee from idolatry. Christians are those on whom the culmination of the ages has come. The Christian era is referred to as the last days in Hebrews 1, verses 1 and 2. This means the examples of the Old Testament were written for the benefit of future generations, especially for Christians who, like Paul, look to the past in order to avoid life's pitfalls. Paul says, don't be arrogant in thinking that you're stronger than Israel. They did what you have done. They followed God. They had faith in Him. They were baptized. They were sustained by His power. They even had fellowship with Christ. They communed with Him. But they fell into apostasy and idolatry just as anyone can. By telling the Corinthians, no temptation has overtaken you except what's common to mankind, Paul is offering us, I think, at least two truths. One, if temptations are not unique, that means other people have been tempted as you have and are, and they've withstood the trial. So if they can do it, so can you. That's the encouragement. But second, if temptations are not unique, it means others have been tempted as you are, and they may be available to help you. Paul's message here is that we're not alone. Now, this means Christians have to be careful. We ought not to stigmatize certain sins and make it to where people who are struggling with those temptations are afraid to confess their inclinations and their struggles because of the stigma that we have attached to certain things. No, believers have to work hard to make sure that we are available for one another. And that takes trust and love and care. All those things that Paul so often talks about in his writings. Now, about verse 12, where Paul says, if you think you're standing, watch out that you do not fall, Blomberg writes this. Verse 12 summarizes the significance of these warnings for the Christians. Even those who think that they stand securely should take care. After all, the pagan temple feast in Corinth involves similar idolatry, sexual sin, and trying God's patience. Nevertheless, verses 1 through 12, which are verses of warning, are all balanced by the marvelous promise of verse 13. The circumstances that tempt us to sin are never qualitatively different from those which God's people of every era have experienced, and we never have to give in to them. There's always an escape hatch, which is defined as a way to persevere without sinning in whatever difficult situation we find ourselves. The promise, articulated by Paul, is music to the ears of troubled believers. God is faithful. We're not always faithful, but God is faithful. He'll not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear, but when you are tempted, He'll always provide a way out so that you can endure it. Now, while this is a wonderful promise, I do want to offer a word of caution here. We shouldn't push Paul's words too far. I've heard some people, in reference to this verse, who have concluded that God would never allow them to be tempted in certain ways. God would never let this happen to me, or He would never allow this temptation to come into my life. And they reason because they say, I'm too weak to handle that. I know I couldn't withstand that temptation. Therefore, Paul teaches God will never allow me to be tempted in that way. I don't think that's the message here. The temptations will come. The promise is that God will always make it possible for us to do what He says in the very next verse, to flee. Flee from idolatry. So temptations abound, but the Spirit of God is ever present. If Christians will allow the Holy Spirit to lead, they will develop eyes which can spot the way of escape from every temptation. You know, the reality is, some of the Corinthian Christians were trying to keep one foot in Christ and the other in their pagan community. Like Israel, they were about to take a plunge. Christians today, like the Corinthians, need to investigate the history of God's people to learn the dangers of idolatry and apostasy. Believers must learn from Israel and the Corinthians to avoid the pitfalls of life. With God's helping hand, maturity and holiness can be achieved. The devil's temptations are a real and present danger, and all Christians must flee idolatry in all its manifestations by following the sage words of James. Submit yourselves, therefore, to God. Resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. James 4, verses 7 and 8. The sad reality for many modern, independent people is that many of us believe in a kind of self-sufficiency that leaves very little room for God. Americans especially love the tale of the successful self-made business owner or politician who came from nothing and made a great name for himself or herself. Many arrogantly boast of their high status in life, which they believe was achieved by grit, determination, and hard work. This kind of thinking is a plague on the church because it breeds the exact mindset about which Paul warned. If you think you're standing firm, be careful that you don't fall. 1 Corinthians 10, verse 12. And so our closing prayer is that all of God's people will humbly learn from history and grow in the grace of Christ Jesus our Lord through that learning. Thank you so much for being here for this study. We've got one more lesson, and then we'll conclude our analysis of this middle section, 1 Corinthians chapters 8 through 10. So come back next time to be with us for that. God bless you, and I'll see you then.